Good afternoon, everyone. I am Burçin. I'm the Energy Policy Director at the Institute for Policy Integrity at New York University School of Law. And welcome to Day 2 of Advancing Energy Justice, Tools for Justice 40 and Equitable Deep Decarbonization. Yesterday, we had really important conversations. We heard from agency representatives who talked about their implementations plans for Justice 40, how they're defining disadvantaged communities, the metrics they're looking at, and gaps that academic researchers could help with. We also heard from community organizations and researchers who partner with communities on the ground on how we can better leverage community knowledge and community expertise for doing more inclusive and meaningful research. Understanding and listening and truly supporting communities and not engaging in extractive forms of research. Yesterday, we had over 450 people tune into the conversation, which just speaks to the critical importance of the issues we're discussing here. So we are very excited to continue the conversation today. We are going to be turning to researchers today. We're going to hear about existing research tools and methods that could be leveraged for Justice 40 and energy justice. We're also going to talk about restorative justice tools from different disciplines and how we can apply those frameworks to equitable deep decarbonization. And finally, at the end of the day, we're going to have breakout discussion sessions. We will have agency representatives and academic experts lead deep dive discussions on transportation, energy poverty, labor impacts, and place-based research. We want these sessions to be a networking opportunity for people working on similar topics. So please attend if you can. We would like people to brainstorm on the issues, discuss next steps, research priorities, and potentially lead to interdisciplinary collaborations. Again, we want this day to be as interactive as possible, so do not hesitate to use the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, comment on the presentations, and respond to other attendees' questions. Yesterday, we had a very active Q&A discussions going on, and we are saving the threads and we'll find a way to share it with all the attendees. We will also be periodically putting in the chat a Google form for you to send us your projects, data, or models that could help with energy justice research in general and Justice 40. At the end of the conference or after the end of the conference, we are going to put together a conference report to publish insights from the panels, these Q&A threads, and the resources that you send us. All right. Today's first session, I'm very excited to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Anna Spurlock. Dr. Spurlock is a research scientist and deputy department head in the Sustainable Energy and Environmental Systems Department at Berkeley Lab. She's an environmental and behavioral economist by training. She's also a DOE Justice 40 Fellow at the DOE Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. As part of this role, she's working on DOE's Justice 40 implementation plan, but also she's serving as the DOE representative for both the technical working group on discounting equity and risk aversion in support of the interagency working group on social cost of greenhouse gases, and also the distributional analysis subgroup in the Office of Management and Budget process for modernizing regulatory review. And I cannot think of anybody more suited to start the day 2 of this conversation. So Anna, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Burçin. All right, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is a framework for a kind of a concept of what equitable deep decarbonization sort of modeling exercises can or should look like. This is a kind of a brief overview summarizing some work that we have in a paper that's under review I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Selma Almala and Tony Reams on this, and of course, a lot of guidance and support from Shalonda Baker. So basically what happened is about a year ago, I started as on my detail to the Department of Energy as a Justice 40 Fellow, and Shalonda tasked me with reviewing the landscape of literature on deep decarbonization studies and to consider what equitable deep decarbonization would be, and to write up like a definition or a framework for what equitable deep decarbonization should be or could be. And so, you know, in starting that process, I first asked myself kind of what is a framework? And the way I was thinking about it is a framework is very similar to a model itself, right? To the way that we use models in sort of technical quantitative modeling work. It creates a shared language for people to be able to exchange ideas and understand what each other are saying. It creates a roadmap or a structure that helps people organize their ideas and communicate them. And it also creates a frame of reference to enable different concepts to be understood in relation to each other. And so that was sort of this kind of idea of combining concepts was something that ended up being a fruitful one for me to kind of grapple with this task. So basically what ended up being a way to sort of distill down the way that I was thinking about this concept of equitable deep decarbonization was basically to create a mapping between the process of deep decarbonization pathways modeling and what are the components of just defining a model and creating a structure to look at deep decarbonization pathways and the trade-offs therefrom, and map that to energy justice. And so we basically, you know, chose the four tenets of energy justice as the concepts that we kind of map over to the process of the modeling. And this, you know, basically creates, like I said, a shared language to talk about what a process for equitable deep decarbonization modeling can look like. So real quick as background, you know, deep decarbonization pathways modeling, for those that aren't familiar, basically what that involves is, you know, taking the fact that the United States has established a target of net zero emissions by 2050. And basically what these studies do is they take a look at the landscape of all the different potential pathways for achieving carbon abatement, either policies or technologies or things like that. And the idea is using these models, and generally the approach that's taken is that there's a desire to find the best way to achieve that target of net zero emissions by that date. And best tends to be defined in terms of monetary costs of the sort of overarching kind of investment costs of each of those potential pathways. Generally, these studies, and there's a number of them that have grappled with this very important and difficult question, tend to focus the scope really in a limited sense on carbon abatement and monetary costs. Some of these reports contain discussions of other factors that are relevant, like socioeconomic or political considerations, job creation, or geopolitical competitiveness. But those outcomes tend not to be directly modeled or quantified, and certainly not sort of held up in a comparable metric to like costs or carbon. And this for us was what we saw as the gap, the fact that, you know, there were missing pieces of the puzzle to be able to really say that we were thinking about the equity considerations in this space. So Shalonda Baker yesterday in her keynote defined or sort of discussed the background on energy justice and what that sort of scholarship came from. I'll just briefly mention, basically, energy justice action and scholarship grapples with the conflicts between the global energy system and vulnerable communities. It grew out of the environmental and climate justice movements. And there are a number of different scholars that have written about energy justice and kind of define different components of what energy justice entails. For the purposes of this framework, as I mentioned, we're using the 4 tenets of energy justice. There's a citation there for one example of where these different tenets are sort of defined and discussed, and this was one that we relied upon. And the 4 tenets are recognition justice, procedural justice, distributional justice, and restorative justice. So basically, this is the framework. I'm going to walk through it step by step. And it basically kind of involves kind of 3 steps for how you specify different kind of elements of choices when it comes to kind of creating a model. And they all center around the concept of restorative justice. So it starts in step 1 with recognition justice. Basically, recognition justice basically involves recognizing the fact that different people have different and valid perspectives, that people from different backgrounds have relevant information to provide. They have valid opinions and priorities that should be acknowledged and honored. And in particular, that the context of their sort of historic experience and lived experience, and in particular, if they're communities that have experienced sort of accumulation of historic burdens and harms due to structural issues in our society and our system, that those experiences definitely inform their perspectives, and that should be acknowledged and included in the conversation. In the context of this sort of exercise of specifying a model, the way that I thought about mapping that concept to the process of modeling is to basically have it inform how we basically define who is explicitly recognized in the model. And what that means in modeling terms is the indices or characteristics used to identify subpopulations or regions for whom the model will create disaggregate results of the outcomes. And sort of this relates to the Justice 40 policy context that we've talked about a little bit, right? Like the definition of disadvantaged communities is something that fits in this category of activity, where we have to create these different indices, these different definitions of what a disadvantaged community is, and the different inputs that go into that definition and how they're weighted is all a part of this process that sort of fits within what I'm calling this step 1 process that relates to the recognition justice piece. The second step involves the procedural justice element. So procedural justice basically holds that underserved and overburdened communities should be engaged in decision-making and have a voice, exercise energy democracy, and have agency over their lives. This requires routine and ongoing engagement with stakeholders, and even ideally should be involve community-driven prioritization and conversations. And the process of procedural justice should be broad in scope and encompassing a lot of elements of what it means to sort of think through the concepts that are pertinent to this modeling exercise, if that's the exercise that's being undertaken. But in particular, and at a minimum, one of the things that I think is really important to get from this procedural justice piece of the process is, in essence, an understanding of how these affected communities define their own priorities. And what that means in a modeling exercise, that defining priorities or defining what matters is reflected in a model in defining the objective function, if it's an optimization model, or the primary outcome metrics that the model is going to demonstrate. And so, as I mentioned, in sort of a lot of the deep decarbonization studies that are out there, the only outcome metrics that are included are carbon and cost, monetary cost. But there are a ton of co-benefits and co-costs that vary across different investment pathways or strategies for decarbonization, and understanding how communities prioritize those particular outcomes and what really matters to communities is a big part of this procedural justice step, in my opinion. The third step is distributional justice, and that sets forth that the environmental, energy, and climate and other benefits and costs should be equitably distributed across communities. So in some ways, this is sort of the outcome of steps 1 and 2, where we have defined these different subpopulations, or sort of this dimension of heterogeneity in different communities. In step 1, we've defined the outcome metrics that we're prioritizing and modeling in step 2. And step 3 ends up being where we actually ensure that the model can demonstrate how those outcome metrics vary across those communities. But I will highlight that there's some really critical choices that have to be made when creating a model in different contexts that can enable this quantification of those metrics across these different communities. And in particular, of importance is that level of resolution in the model. There's a lot of studies that have demonstrated that when you have too coarse a level of resolution, that you're missing some of the relationships between pertinent factors and end up biasing the results. Things like air quality impacts and climate damages. There's some very prominent examples that have recently shown a lot of that. Additionally, in the model, there has to be an appropriate building in of the sensitivities of how the outcome metrics change in relation to different policies or technologies that are being considered in the face of the baseline conditions of the different communities or subpopulations that are being specified in the model. That those baseline conditions of those populations are going to, in a lot of cases, matter for their response function, so to speak, with respect to the outcome metrics for these different policies, and that really needs to be considered carefully and done as effectively as possible in the modeling exercise. So as I mentioned, restorative justice sort of sits at the center of all of this. Restorative justice calls for a repair of harms done to communities and the environment. And in particular, in the context of this framework, we're sort of talking about how important it is to bring that to the forefront at the beginning of the exercise. That it can be used as an ex-ante criteria to inform step 1, the identification of communities recognized, and step 2, the metrics prioritized, and how the model is going to be able to demonstrate how those metrics vary across the communities based on the different pathways that are being assessed. And this expands a bit on the way that restorative justice has tended to be discussed, at least in the energy justice literature that I was reading, where the concept of restorative justice is tends more to be described as sort of an ex post assessment of necessary compensation. So that, say, for example, if the government is considering a particular policy or measure, and that the idea of restorative justice is that looking forward, if they're considering this policy or measure, they should consider the fact that if they make a choice that imposes a cost on a community like this, that they'll need to incur the cost of sort of compensation for those damages, and so that should affect their choices. But what we're saying is there's a historic context of, systemic injustice, accumulation of burdens and harms that already exists. We heard a lot about that yesterday. Many people have been talking about that for a long time. All of that should inform ex ante the choices that are made in terms of how we're approaching defining the policy's context in this modeling exercise. And so that's sort of something that I want to underscore here. So just to kind of walk through just a narrow example, but just to make it a little bit more concrete, thinking about the fact, for example, that that there in decarbonization studies or in decarbonization pathways, one of the potential co-benefits that's really relevant to communities is climate adaptation. So that some of the different measures, when we're considering pathways to decarbonization, some of those measures have adaptation co-benefits and some kind of less so. And that's an example of a particular outcome that could be included in deep decarbonization studies, and that relates to this whole framework that I was referring to. So just to walk through that as an example. So in terms of step 1, recognition justice, basically recognizing that the climate crisis has disproportionately harmed people of color in the US, and this pattern is projected to continue. as climate change increases in the future. There's a ton of studies out there showing disparities in urban heat island exposure and heat-related deaths, both historic and projected, in failure of resilience of the energy system due to climate-driven events, etc. I'm showing here just a couple of results from a couple of papers from the Climate Impact Lab that showed basically, both internationally and within the US, in essence, that when we're thinking about the different types of damages that result from climate change, in essence, what we see in those studies that lower income people, the nature of the damage that they are facing, the nature of the risk is mortality. Whereas higher income people also face a cost from climate change in these studies, but the cost comes forward in the form of adaptation costs, not mortality. And so we just see this really systemic disparity in terms of what we're actually talking about when we're talking about climate risk, and that the nature of sort of vulnerable populations really matters for this story. So basically, this historic context mediates the capacity of these overburdened communities to adapt to climate impacts and underscores the need for decarbonization strategies that simultaneously provide protection from severe heat exposure and increase community resilience to acute climate-driven events. Step 2 in the procedural justice, again, what this step really entails is an extended and involved and meaningful engagement and dialogue with affected communities. Again, as I mentioned, the idea is that these decarbonization measures can result in a range of different co-benefits, whether it's wealth building, health improvements, climate adaptation, reduced energy burden, improved comfort, improved access to opportunities, etc. Many of these benefits can both enable restorative justice by rectifying historic disenfranchisement and can build capacity for societies to improve, and also for like this adaptation to improve going forward into the future. So again, I'm just giving an example here that's just looking at, for example, just the adaptation status as a potential kind of co-benefit. But the idea is to be comprehensive and to try to elicit the range of things, that the metrics that need to be included, not just one, right? But just to sort of point out, I'm citing here the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, which is a community-based organization that had a visioning statement in that, they did articulate, for example, that climate adaptation co-benefits, that there are those that are relevant to vulnerable communities, energy reliability and resilience, protection from extreme heat events, protection from negative impacts associated with climate-driven disasters like wildfires, etc. So, as I mentioned, step 3 is assessing the distributional justice through appropriate modeling resolution. Just to kind of highlight on something that I mentioned already, the choice of the structure of the model can really matter for this. And I just want to give an example of that. So in integrated assessment models, which is one type of model that is used in decarbonization studies, it's also a type of model that's used in assessing the damages from potential future climate change. And sort of valuing those damages. So in those models, there are 2 interconnected pathways to mitigate damages from climate change. One is reducing emissions, obviously, and the other is increasing adaptation status. And this is because adaptation status in those models is a function of current and historic income. And that's sort of used as a proxy in the way these models are done, but more could be done to get sort of under the surface on that. So adaptation status relates to weatherization, air conditioning, increased energy security, reduced energy burden, etc. And so the modeled benefits of a specific decarbonization strategy are a function of the baseline conditions of the population, of their historic status when it comes to adaptation, for example. So to really account for and understand the true sort of story in terms of which decarbonization pathways result, or kind of how they trade off against each other in terms of all the metrics, we really have to account for both pathways. And so there's different considerations that really matter for how to do this well in terms of spatial resolution of the model, et cetera. And based on my experience, no deep decarbonization study has actually done this. And if you do this, the idea is that the trade-offs between different types of climate mitigation investments may look very different, where, for example, rooftop solar with the ability to island or weatherization programs, in the way that they trade off against something like utility scale solar, when you're just looking at monetary costs, it's going to be a different story than if you're accounting for all the co-benefits associated for example, adaptation status or other factors to those more distributed investments, for example. So in essence, Equitable Deep Decarbonization Framework provides a shared language that people from varied backgrounds can use to fruitfully collaborate. It enables solutions that realize all the potential benefits from energy transition for all communities, particularly those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we argue that a multidisciplinary boundary crossing sort of collaboration is critical to doing this type of work well and having success in the form of our energy transition. And the idea is that equitable deep decarbonization is an opportunity to jointly accomplish the goals of addressing climate change while maximizing the multiplicative benefits potential of the mitigation measures that are being considered. So that is the overview that I have, and I hope that sort of helps set the stage for the great discussions that we have coming.